Okay, you've just released a new remix of War of the Worlds, which was released for, I think it was Record Store Day on the 19th of October. My question is, in your opinion, what does this remix contribute to, say, the history of this piece? What has changed with it?
The reason I did it, Barry, is that even though it was a hit when it first came out,
Hmm?
I never did like a 3.5 minute edit. It was just the full length album version. And I thought, well, crumbs, all these years later, there's been so many remixes by others, some very successful and interesting. So I did just what I was describing, cut it down to a single length version of something like 3 minutes 20, and then remastered it so it's punchier. And that's really the sole reason that I did it all these years later.
Yeah, that's a good reason as well. It's on nice coloured vinyl, which I noticed. I haven't managed to acquire a copy because I think they were limited edition, but it looks very nice. And of course, the Spirit of Man tour begins in 2025, if I'm not mistaken. Is this a kind of a new production, and how does this stage production how has it evolved? I think since its first staging.
Every tour we've ever done for the arenas, whether it's been in the UK, Ireland, Europe, we've been as far as Australia, New Zealand. Every every new production, every new tour, I try to grow it organically. Technology changes so dramatically and fast these days, as you know. So there's always something that I can sort of add to the next iteration of our arena touring. So next year is no different. We have a range of new ingredients, both more from a organic creative point of view, but as well as technological. We used to, up until very recently, just have our show on stage, whereas the last couple of tours, it's grown out into the audience, over the audience, with large scale effects. Our surround sound engulfs the audience better than it ever has. So I've always treated it as a living work.
Yeah, I'm certainly. I think I'll be going to the Nottingham show here in the UK. I'm certainly looking forward to that. I mean, if we go back a bit, I was intrigued to ask you. And was it your father's role in things like Guys and Dolls and Two Cities that prompted your own interest in musicals and musical adaptation?
Uh, Absolutely. My dad was a very popular singer, actor in the United States in my early years before we moved here to England. He did Broadway, he toured, had three number one records in a row. So I grew up around creative people. Those were his best friends, so to speak, writers, directors, performers. He was also a national standard tennis player. So those two influences really have what driven me through all my life to date. When we moved to England, I was a little boy, and he had the romantic lead in what was the original West End production of Guys and Dolls, which had transferred from the United States, from New York. So I grew up hearing musicals, loving them, and music became such a main point of my life after that.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, it intrigues me really. This production War of the Worlds. I mean, in the mid '70s, you've got disco, which had seized the hearts and minds and trousers of a generation. You had, and then on the other hand, you had punk rock pogoing its way across the inner city areas. I mean, what made you think that a musical adaptation of a literary work would be so successful?
I didn't. That's the truth of it. I had no preconception of, oh, this is going to be a surefire hit. I didn't even know at the start whether it would get a release, much less become what it did. And I remember literally no more than a couple of weeks before it was released uh, in the UK and being asked, doing a couple of interviews, what was my aspirations for it, and I vividly remember answering, well, if I could see it in the United Kingdom album charts for 1 week, I will have felt I haven't let anybody down. The guest artist, my musicians, my parent, my family, the record company, not realizing that it would sustain for 330 consecutive weeks in the UK album charts and spread all over the world, or most of the world's market. So I could never have predicted that by a million miles. And as you were saying, you had disco was king of the dance floor, punk was the music revolution of the day. And I have to just add, for what it's worth, I was a young musician at the time, so I had angst like the punk rockers, except it seemed I needed almost 2 hours to say it when they were doing it in 3, 4 minute bursts.
Well, there's certainly plenty of angst in War of the Worlds. It's an existential threat, isn't it? Uh, it certainly almost feeds into that whole idea of what I would call progressive rock. I'm just wondering, what was your relationship with progressive rock at the time?
It wasn't singular.
Hmm.
There were artists that were coming from that area of music who I admired, but I've always had sort of a very, I guess, Catholic taste in music. It's whatever moves me. It can go from classical, it can go up to today's artists, and if
Hmm.
it moves me in the heart and soul, that's all I care about. But I definitely understand how my musical version of the War of the Worlds has been classified at times as a good example of prog rock, only because I think it represents maybe experimentation, a type of artist that is looking to express him or herself in a way that doesn't fit an easy genre that had previously existed.
Sure. You said you involved. I know you worked with Rick Wakeman regarding his whole orchestral suite. How did that come about?
It came about from both of us being asked to write a top and a tail of a new interpretation of Holtz's The Planets.
Mhm.
And that was the beginning of it. He coincidentally used to play on some of my uh, music for advertising as a session musician. And so we got to know each other in a few different ways. But I think it would be fair to say he had ideas that were not slotting into the format of the day with some of his own work.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Um, and we go back to War of the Worlds. I mean, Richard Burton certainly adds a theatrical flair to the production. Was he always your first choice?
He was the top of what wasn't a particularly long list. I think we had maybe 3 or 4 names, as well as Richard at the top of our list. In that, by the time we started thinking about the various roles, and our journalist is the only one who passes through the entire work, is a non-singing role, pure acting role. All the others were primarily singing roles with a bit of acting. And I knew that I always had hoped that we'd attract an actor whose voice had a gravitas that would sort of take you in to our world of the War of the Worlds. And Richard was at the top of this very short list, and easy to make a list. Now, how do you actually find the person and even find out if that person might be interested? And it came about, I guess, by dumb luck, in that uh, we had some friends that had been on holiday in New York and had just come over for dinner one evening, and they were telling us about their holiday. And one of the things they did was to see Richard in a play called Equus at the Palace Theater, not the Palace, the Plymouth Theater on Broadway.
Yep.
And I thought, well, crumbs, here we just created this little list. At least I know where to find him. Now, bear in mind, no email, no Google, nothing of that sort in this period of time. So I posted a stamp in an envelope, put a letter of introduction from me explaining what I was trying to do with H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds. sent him a copy of the first draft of our script, which was written by my stepmother, who was married to my dad. She was an author in her own right, and born in Hull, raised in Manchester,
Hmm.
and sent that draft and sent it, my little package, to the stage door of the Plymouth Theater, hoping that whoever was in charge of the stage door would actually hand Richard my little care package.
Hmm.
Truthfully, I had no confidence that any of that was going to happen, but it couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 days later that I received a call from a man named Robert Lance, who was Richard's personal manager. And I was actually just finishing dinner with my father and Doreen, his wife, uh, talking about the War of the Worlds, as we were doing quite often at that point. And Mr. Lance rang, introduced himself, and said, Richard has received your package. He loves the idea, and the words that I'll never forget that he then said was, count him in, dear boy. And sure enough, we counted him in. And I handed the phone to my dad because my dad, is a producer of shows and things, I felt he'd have a better connection with Mr. Lance. And they actually did a deal on the phone in 20 to 30 minutes, which is sustained to this very day.
Wow. Wow. Was Richard Burton, was he a difficult man to work with? Because I've heard conflicting stories about him.
I don't think you've heard conflicting in the sense that maybe they were true or maybe they weren't.
Yeah.
I think he did have a bit of a reputation
Hmm.
that was well documented. I only had one experience with him when he walked into the studio in California to record, and he had left Equus and gone to California to make a movie. And if we wanted to record him in the time frame that I had been scheduling, I, my dad, Doreen, my recording engineer, our lyricist, we all had to sort of become like Muhammad and visit the mountain
Hmm.
and wait for him to be available. We had 5 studio days on hold, which he had contractually committed to as well. But coming back to your question, the man that walked through into the studio was the most charming, well prepared performer you could ever have asked for. And to give you an idea of what I mean by that, uh, Barry, was that instead of 5 days, he did 93 sections in just the one day.
Wow. Wow. I mean, I read somewhere that he wanted to do the narration without actually hearing the music. Did this cause you any problems?
No, it didn't cause any problems, and it was probably the very right decision because for some reason in my mind, I thought if he hears the music and performs to it, he'll get a better idea of the music and the storyline. But we tried it out on the first few takes, and he was becoming, I think, the first known rapper in music. And he was not that mellifluous actor with such gravitas
Mhm.
without trying, really. That was just his voice. So I came with our engineer with 75 multi-track tapes, 24-track tapes, and they were very quickly put away and shipped back to the studio in London. And we just recorded the script Wild. He was directed. We had a director who, with my dad, did the direction. And I made notes along the way and checked the timings for every sequence. And there it was, all in one day.
Excellent, wonderful. I mean, you also involved David Essex in this. I think was it you when you produced his album or helped produce his album Rock On? Is this what recommended him for this role?
Well, I worked with David over a 5 year period.
Hmm.
So by the time uh, we were doing the War of the Worlds, we had 2 or 3 albums already released, quite a number of singles that had done very well. So not only were we working together so very well, uh, we had become good friends.
Yeah.
And his age, his style of performance was, in my mind, perfect for the role of a young artilleryman who has a vision for mankind's survival. And while he does other sections, his main piece on his own is called Brave New World. And instead of just recording it solely in the studio, there were a couple of acting scenes with the journalist. And I thought, what a possibly good idea if David was interested in coming over and do the scenes live with Richard in the studio. So including the 93 sequences that Richard did on the one day, they did their 2 scenes as well. And it just worked fine. As for the singing role, I demoed for everybody who was a guest artist. I didn't presume because I may have worked with some of them or knew them, they would just automatically agree to come onto this sort of project that a lot of my friends in the band started calling it Jeff's Folly because of it not fitting into any format. And they stayed with me. And so I demoed everything. And so David, Julie Covington, who had already been working with, I demoed those with great session musicians, singers, and all the others at the same time as well.
Yeah, yeah. I read an interesting quote from a chap named David Hill in his book Beyond the Martian Horizon. He states that this musical allows us to explore what it is to be human in an increasingly chaotic world. Do you agree with that?
I sure do. I mean, if you take a look at H.G. Wells's main themes of his book, it's not a shoot 'em up, knock 'em down science fiction story.
Mhm.
It's about Martians who represent invaders.
Mhm.
And no matter who was invading who, HG took serious critique with that, including at that point the British Empire, which was at its peak during that period of its own expansionism. So, you know, he had something to say. His other themes that attracted me as well was about faith, no matter what faith you might be, about hope for mankind, about love and not giving up. Very real emotions. And look at the world we're in today. Is it any different? Is it worse? I mean, it's remarkable how relevant the way that he approached his story
Yeah.
has survived. It's probably why it's still, you know, in publication. New ways of interpreting it are coming about. I fell in love with a dark Victorian tale. That's really what it appealed to me and my dad, because we were partners on it, and wound up presenting ourselves to his son, Frank Wells, not to be confused with his brother, also named Frank,
Mhm.
uh, at the offices of his agents. And because it was still very much in copyright when I first read the book.
Yeah.
And in order to do what I had hoped to do, we had to acquire the rights. So we were able to pull that off. And Frank loved the idea of me staying true to his dad's work. In other words, keeping it as a dark Victorian tale. And his agents actually had no idea about my career up to that point, but they did remember seeing my dad in Guys and Dolls,
Yeah.
which was an amazing coincidence. So between Frank and his agents, we did acquire all the rights to his father's work.
Yeah. You've kind of preempted the question I was going to ask you. Actually, you've probably already answered it, and that was, yeah, what do you think makes this piece a timeless piece? And I think because it taps into that essential human experience of love, faith, and existential threat. I think, which is very much apparent in this. Do you think there's anything else to it? Do you think that that contributes to its longevity, your musical as well as the story?
Well, thank you for saying that about my musical version. If it has contributed, then that's a cherry on the cake.
Hmm.
As to the sustainability of this incredible work, while it has all those human themes and places and people that you can sort of associate with, HG's imagination went beyond human, human experiences. If you look at his Martians, they were the size of a large bear. And in order to complete their bodies, they had to fit into one of three machines that he created. Uh, a Martian fighting machine whose main job in life was to fight, a flying machine which was to scan the Earth, and a handling machine whose job in life was to pick up living humans and to drop them in a large metal basket that's on the back of these machines, and for the Martians inside to feed off of the living blood of these humans.
Yeah.
So it's quite fantastic. It's got drama. It's got natural fear within the realms of his ideas, but set against human experiences.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you said you were interested in a dark Victorian tale. Did you not consider something like, I don't know, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde or Great Expectations, or was that the first story, or maybe even other H.G. Wells stories like The Time Machine or things like that? Were there other stories that you appeal to you?
During that period of the books that I and my dad and Doreen were reading, I did read, I remember, and considering uh, Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea,
Okay.
Aldous Huxley's Brave New World,
Yeah.
uh, John Wyndham's The Day of the Triffids,
It's yeah.
and there were others. But two of those, The Day of the Triffids and Brave New World, actually are influenced by H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds.
Yeah.
So in a way, there are sections that cover those subjects.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it was all the human nature in the themes that H.G. created that really just attached me to loving this book.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I've got to ask you actually, is how did the beautiful Forever Autumn come to be included in this work? So I love Justin Hayward's voice, and it's a song that has kind of taken on a life of its own, I think. But I mean, how did it come to be included in this work?
Well, the truth is that it began life as a TV commercial for Lego toys.
Yeah.
Not that it was ever intended to be a singing one with words.
Mhm.
Uh, and being a 30-second commercial, the melody, which had what I call doo-doos by two vocalists that I'd worked a lot with. So they doo-dooed for what was the equivalent of about one verse of what became Forever Autumn. And it went do 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 do.
Hmm.
And that was the beginning of how Forever Autumn became a full-blown song. But I never wanted Forever Autumn to be in the War of the Worlds because my goal as a composer was to write 100% new content. And it just happened that when I came to the part of the story when what became Forever Autumn came about, and it was the journalist who had a fiance, and he was living in uh, near Woking on Maybury Hill in Surrey, and she was living, his fiance was living with her father in London. And he decides with this invasion taking hold of Earth, he wanted to get to London and take her father and her out of harm's way and head toward the south coast of England and perhaps even get a boat out of England. And he finally arrives by foot at their house, but she's not there. And that's sort of what reminded me of the key lyrical line, because you're not here.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I kept saying to myself, gosh, Forever Autumn. Okay, it started off as a commercial. We extended it as a song uh, for a different album. It was the debut album of the two singers who were on the commercial.
Uh-huh.
And it became a giant hit in Japan, of all places. And I kept saying to myself, no, 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 it's out. It's already an existing song. I want to try to find something original.
Hmm.
And I kept trying. And then as the sessions started getting closer and the pressure of not having anything, I kept coming back to, well, what am I fighting here? The song is perfect. The lyrics say exactly what I want. Musically, I think my music had the right mood. And eventually I waved the white flag to the Martians, and Forever Autumn suddenly was in.
Well, and you know it works so well because Justin Hayward's delivery of that song adds as sort of the melancholic ache of the piece, and it fits in so beautifully with the whole production. I think, just my opinion, of course. Um, I'd love to know what Phil Lynott was like to work with.
Phil was quite an amazing character. I was a fan of Thin Lizzy.
Hmm.
Well, I was aware of probably most, if not everything, that they had recorded. And there was one song that called Fool's Gold
Okay.
that Phil starts with some moody music behind him, and he's talking for about 20 seconds or so. And it's quite dramatic, and the presence in his voice. And I'm thinking, he's got a real, aside from an amazing singing voice,
Hmm.
he's got, he understands words.
Yeah.
And I was looking for, at that point, somebody to play the role of Parson Nathaniel, who was um, a character that you'd think at that point, when disasters striking all over England, that you'd go to for your moral and spiritual comfort, your local man of the cloth.
Hmm.
And I, I wasn't looking for somebody straight, so to speak. I wanted somebody who had a bit of madness in his own voice, and I thought Phil had a natural ingredient in his singing voice. But now that I heard him do a reading of his own words at the start of the song, I wanted to approach him. And I didn't know him, but I did know somebody who introduced me to his managers. They liked the idea and passed the idea on to Phil, who was immediately up for it. And he came into the studio that I was recording the War of the Worlds in, or pretty much most of it, in London. And we got on really well, and he loved the idea. And uh, he was now our Parson Nathaniel. And it was a joy to work with him. My dad directed him on the acting sections. I produced all the singing and, of course, all the music and the mixing. But they got on great, and he was a true rock and roller, but he was also a man with a real deep soul. And on the last day of our sessions together, he handed me a book that had come out a couple of years earlier. It was a book of poetry, songs while I'm away, that he gave me, and it still has pride of place with his inscription in it.
Hmm.
And I look back at a wonderful experience and regret how early he died.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, going back to progressive rock, what made you cast Fish in your version of Spartacus?
And I think anybody that I've ever worked with, whether it's been our tours, whether it's been on my musical projects, I've approached them simply for one reason. I admire their work.
Yeah.
They had something in their sound, their way of performing.
Were you a
Uh,
Marillion fan then?
uh, I was, but um, Fish wasn't the original lead singer.
Okay.
So when I came to know about Marillion, it was more when Fish had taken over. And I
Hmm.
just heard this, I think he's from Glasgow. It's certainly a Scottish voice. And I just thought he could be perfect if he'd be interested. And he was.
Yeah, yeah, excellent. I've one last question for you, and that is Frank Zappa said all good music has been written by people in wigs and stuff. Do you think music can offer anything new now, or has it all been done?
No, I don't think it's all been done, not by a long shot, because, think back of the great classical composers. What did they write with? What did they score their music to? With probably quills, uh, with no electricity, so candlelight, with limited instruments of the day. And then you start coming forward in time. There's always something new. There's always a writer that has a different spin on life, different emotions. And it's a mix of all of that. Plus, technology has changed so dramatically that the sounds that are created motivate you how to write and produce music today. You can have your favorite music, of course, from any generation, as we all do, but uh, I don't think we're even close to running out of ideas.
Excellent, excellent. Anyway, I'll finish by plugging the fact that the Spirit of Man tour does begin next year. It's going across the UK, and I think including a couple of dates in London. I'm hoping to go to the Nottingham show, and I would urge you all to check it out. I will, of course, put a link to the dates just below this video. Jeff, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. Best of luck with the new production and any other musicals you might feel you want to embark on in the next year or so.
Indeed. Well, Barry, thanks for inviting me on your show. If you do come to our show in Nottingham, maybe let me know and we can attach a face to a name rather than via Zoom.
Yes, absolutely. I'd love to do that. I might bring my 10-year-old son as well, so I think he'll enjoy the experience as well. So it'd be absolutely fabulous. Anyway, thank you so much, and the best of luck. Anyway, all the best.
Okay, you too, Barry. All the best.
Okay, bye bye.
See ya.